Hello everyone, it is Jazz here and welcome to episode 7, I think it's 7, of the Jane Eyre Project, this fabulous little project where I read books related to the novel Jane Eyre. Today we're going to be discussing the book Jane by Patricia Park. This has been a journey. It's been a year of trying to get this video made for this book. I really enjoy this book and it frustrates me that I have not been able to figure out a tone that I'm happy with. I've read this book twice. I've filmed this video 3 times trying to figure out what works and I can't figure out what's happening, but we're gonna try this format that I'm going to try right now and hope for the best. I'm going to try to structure this like a mix of a review and a in-depth discussion on some of my favorite themes and things for each part of this book, because this book is separated into 3 parts. So the first part of this video is going to be the spoiler-free review. I'm just going to upfront tell you what I thought of the book, what were the things that I enjoyed about it, the general overall thought, and then after that I'm going to get down into like the spoilery nitty-gritty more in-depth discussion. If you just want to watch the first little part, you can. I've also time-coded all of the sections below if you're just interested in one particular section. And because I've taken some time off from the Jane Eyre project in general, I'm going to do a little housekeeping just so that I can get back onto the reading a book every month sort of schedule. So from now on, the Jane Eyre project videos will always go up on the very last day of every single month. So the next video will be going up on April the 30th. Yes, April the 30th. And for the month of April, I will be reading Death of a Schoolgirl by Joanna Campbell Slan. So if you want to read this book with me, you absolutely can. Before we also jump into this, I made a really good playlist for this book because I've been making a playlist for every book in the Jane Eyre Project series. So if you want to listen to that, I will link you to the blog for the song order, and I will also link you to Spotify if you want to check that out. Let's jump in to talking about Jane. Jane is a fairly modern retelling. It is set in the year 2001, and it focuses on a character named Jane Eyre, who is half Korean and half Caucasian American, living in, at the beginning of the story, Flushing, Queens. She lives and has been adopted by her aunt and uncle, and she also lives with her 2 cousins, and her uncle runs a grocery store called Food, and so she's been working her little her away at her uncle's store. She is supposed to be going into finance and getting a job in finance in the big city in Manhattan, but that situation falls through, and so she decides to take on a job as a nanny for 2 professors named Ed Farley and Beth Mazer, or the Mazer Farleys, if you will, who have adopted a girl from China, and the story rolls on from there. So Jane is very much a modern retelling from a very literary fiction perspective, and also a very coming of age journey in the story, because Jane Eyre is a adult at the beginning of the story, or a young adult at the beginning of the story. She's around probably 22 or so in the beginning of this. So obviously you're not getting all of the things with Jane as a child, but you get a good reference for what her growing up experience is like. I feel like Patricia Park does a really excellent job of mirroring a lot of the experiences that Jane Eyre has and the pressures that Jane Eyre experiences in her life in this book with Jane Eyre. And also because this book is set sort of pre-social media, but also, in fairly modern context, it allows the reader to really view a lot of the concepts that Jane Eyre can talk about through a different lens and see some different things that you could view in Jane Eyre, which I really appreciated, particularly in respect to relationships and feminism and just things about how we grow and change as people. I also really loved learning things about Korea and the Korean language. I particularly like the way language is used in this book. Korean words are used to express an idea, and how it shows that certain words in different languages, not just Korean, don't necessarily have direct translations into English, and how it's actually kind of cool that different languages can have one word that expresses a whole concept, idea, thought, or feeling. And I really just like seeing that. I actually kind of wish English was like that. Wouldn't that be nice? Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. Speaking though of the use of Korean, if in any point in this video, especially in the latter half of this video, the spoilery part, I pronounce a Korean word or name incorrectly, I apologize ahead of time. I do like that the characters are supposed to have equivalents to Jane Eyre, but they are very much their own people in modern context, and they serve different elements in the story than Jane Eyre does, but at the same time, like I already said, it leads you to view maybe a concept of some of the either more problematic or even good things about Jane Eyre in a new way through the characters and the personalities that are presented in this. There is an element of what if to this story, which I appreciate. I don't really want a retelling of Jane Eyre to be exactly like Jane Eyre. Obviously, I've already read that, so I do want to see new things about it and explore new things. But if you are really like a purist to it sticking to all the ideas of Jane Eyre, maybe this isn't particularly for you. Big point that I think is important in a modern retelling of Jane Eyre is that it has to explore that coming of age and getting to know yourself element of the story, and this definitely does this, and I think it's excellently done, and it also just made my heart warm in the end. So if you really like explorations of family and cultural experiences, and you like diving into different sort of social ideologies and the psychology of people in that way, I think that you will enjoy this book, especially if you already enjoy literary fiction. I personally really love this book. I gave it 5 stars. The second time I read this through, I did listen to it on audiobook. A lot of the reviews for the audiobook are negative, and I don't actually think the audiobook is that bad, or it's not the worst audiobook that I've ever heard. I mean, it's not winning any awards by any means, but if you do need to pick this book up in audiobook, it's a workable audiobook that is just fine, in my opinion. If you, like me, wanted more of the correct pronunciation of words and names, I think it's worth checking out. I do think, though, it is a little more fun to just read it in print, but, sometimes you need an audiobook. I believe that's all I have to say for the spoiler-free section of this video. Definitely recommend this book if you want to check it out. And after you've read this book, if it struck your interest, please come back and watch my deep dive section if you want to. I have notes. I'm going to tape them out of shot, hopefully, on the wall. So if you're wondering what I'm looking at, It's my notes. I'll probably still forget to say stuff. I'm going to start with some fun Easter eggs that I just want to mention from Jane Eyre that are in the first part of this book. There were a ton of Easter eggs throughout this book, but these are some ones that, you know, the Jane Eyre nerd in me just got super excited about. So, one is the intro to characters. There's a particularly fun one where Devon, who is the kind of equivalent to Adele, is revealed as a character by reading behind curtains, not unlike how Jane Eyre reads behind curtains at the very beginning of the novel. Another fun one is that Beth, who lectures on feminism, her main goal is to study Victorian literature and talk about it through a feminist standpoint, which is really intriguing because Beth is, of course, the equivalent to Bertha, and that makes sense for that particular character. This book does a good job of showing how Jane Eyre is continuously experiencing a pressure that is a mirror to the Victorian female lifestyle, and the fact that she is expected in her family and community to behave a certain way, express herself in a way that everyone else deems is appropriate. On top of that, there is this element that I don't know is necessarily something that you find in Jane Eyre. The fact that a lot of people kind of want their children or people that they consider children in their family, in Ree's case, to have a certain level of accomplishment so that you can talk about those accomplishments. And so she also feels that sort of family pressure in that aspect as well. And it's a good way to give that reader that same feeling that you get in Jane Eyre with the limitations that Jane Eyre feels. Another thing about Jane's character in this book that I think is a key factor to discussing this book is Jane's feeling of otherness, and how that also is another mirror to Jane Eyre's feel of otherness. So in Jane Eyre, Jane kind of lives in this in-between, right? So when she's growing up with the Reed family, she is neither considered part of the family nor is she considered a servant, which leads to her having a lot of fears about servitude. And then when she grows up, she becomes a governess, where you are still neither a employee nor a family member in that situation. Also, there's this element that even this book explores where one can feel sort of different or otherly because they are an orphan or they are an adopted person. And I like that this book uses that concept by having Jane Eyre basically be in the in-between in every single element of her life in this first part. She's obviously mixed race, one thing that I did somewhat relate to because I am also a mixed race person. And so while I don't think I have had the same exact experience as her, I have had, you know, some experiences where you're like, oh wait, I'm kind of not one thing or the other. But also in terms of Jane Eyre finding her way, she is culturally and career-wise and even in her family considered very much not one thing or the other. And she does take that job to be a nanny. She ends up having a similar state of confusion because, you know, growing up with her aunt and uncle, there is definitely a focus on doing, serving, having common sense, relying on your own self. Don't ask silly questions. Don't express all your feelings. We don't need to talk about everything. Just make stuff happen. And in the Mazer Farley family, obviously, they're like, yeah, like, ask all the questions. Let's discuss it. Like, all these different things. And so she kind of is growing to see that while you might learn things outside of your home, there is a point where you can't take the new things you've learned sometimes back into your home life experience, and that leaves you in an in-between experience. I feel like Jane Eyre just like doesn't take on people's opinions as much as Jane Eyre does. Jane Eyre really does allow herself to make all these in between her feelings of otherness to make her feel less than. There is a point in the story where she just basically says, I feel like I was born bad, that I just can't get anything right because I'm not one thing or the other in any part of my life, and I don't know how to sort of consolidate all of these things about me together. And it also brings us back to the general theme that does kind of get introduced in this first part, where sometimes you just have to be who you want to be. But sometimes, like this character in the first part, you don't know who that is yet, and that's the journey. My favorite element of part one is the concept of the word nunchi. Hopefully I'm saying it correctly. It's a Korean concept signifying the subtle art and ability to listen and gauge others' moods. In Western culture, nunchi could be described as the concept of emotional intelligence. So this book kind of describes it as having just good common sense, but also I would say reading the room. I really like this concept, although sometimes Jane Eyre hears this as like a reprimand, and so sometimes she can overthink the concept or think of it as a negative, but I think this concept is the most perfect comment on the world today. Like, just use your nunchi, people. I know I'm probably pronouncing this word wrong, but the world could use more common sense. I feel like the concept of common sense and reading the room leads real well into a discussion about the character of Beth, which, first of all, I'm glad that unlike her Bertha counterpart, she is not a secret. I do think that, the secret wife in the attic works as a nice mystery element in a Victorian novel that is a gothic romance. I think in a modern perspective, it does not work as well, and it looks real bad. So I'm glad that Beth's just out there being her to a certain extent, because here is the thing about Beth. While she is not at all mentally ill, she is a lot, and she's pretty dang clueless. Cannot see the forest through the trees. She tries so hard to not be offensive that she ends up being offensive. She tries so hard to be a feminist that she sort of starts to lose the point of being a feminist, if that makes any sense. I do think there's a point with any topic or belief system that you can have where you can go so far that nobody thinks that you understand what you're really standing up for anymore. She has a lot of ideologies that she wants to put forth and put on other people in her family and on Jane, and she means well, but she's one of those very brilliant, smart people that totally does not very smart things. While this character drives me and also the other characters in the book up the wall, I do think that she is a good addition to the story, just to show, particularly in this first part, the difference between having good, strong nunchi, if you will, and being totally clueless. Now, in this story, there's a big focus on talking about relationships and power dynamics within relationships, leading the reader to kind of question whether things really work or why things don't work when there's a power dynamic involved in a relationship. There are two power dynamic things that are to be discussed, I think, for part one. One is the idea of the age gap romance, and the other is the idea of employers having affairs and or dating their employees. Now, I'm going to start with the age gap romance situation, and before I start, I just want to say that I don't believe that age gap romances are a bad thing. I do think that it works for people, but I do think that a lot of media and different people have talked about some of the more negative aspects that could show up, and this book's goal in the first part and the third part of the book, we'll come back to discussing this topic, is to kind of show that there can be some red flags in that situation for some people. The first part is the age gap romance between Beth and Ed, and on the Beth side, you do kind of see an element of control to the point of appearing somewhat condescending. A lot of the stuff in the house has to go the way she has, and he doesn't really feel that he has any say in that situation, because she feels like she can exert her overall experience, or at least in initial appearance. We'll get to this in part 3. On top of that, Ed talks about one of the reasons why he's with Beth is because she's brilliant, which leads me to think that for the younger person in these less than positive types of romances, there's this element of being in love with the idea of someone more than there is actually being in love with the person as they are, because these younger people sort of hero worship them at one point in their, formative young adultness. They can't see that person clearly until, I guess, in Ed's case, a little bit later. The affairs with employees thing is something that has come up before in these videos. In fact, it was discussed when I read the book Mr. Rochester, in which Rochester does give his reasoning, or the author created his reasoning for playing that little game with Blanche as a situation where he wanted Jane to come to him so that he didn't have to feel, guilty about the fact that he wanted to get together with an employee, and he wanted her to feel some sort of element of control in the situation. Although I will say, Mr. Rochester, that it was still manipulative. The difference is that I think that there are more opportunities for Edward Rochester to feel some sort of remorse and also gain some humility and realize that to a certain extent his actions are not the correct way to go. I don't think that Regine offers Ed Farley the same opportunities, and that's because of that I think Ed has justified his reasoning for the affair. And there is some deeper reasoning. I think Ed is looking for acceptance for who he is, and that's something that he doesn't get from Beth. Jane Rhee is looking for that same kind of acceptance because she doesn't really get that kind of acceptance, or what she perceives as that kind of acceptance, from anyone in her family, really. And so she is starved for that kind of acceptance and love, and so she's going in that direction. The difference is that Ed thinks what he's doing is fine, and Jane feels a lot of guilt because she has really, first of all, bonded with Devon, having just a lot of the same troubles trying to fit into life, and she's really bonded with that character, made her a lot of promises, and really found a lot of things about her that she could help Devon with through her own experiences. And so she feels like she betrayed this young child and home wrecked her whole family. And also she does feel a lot of guilt about the fact that Beth has invited her into her home and tried to teach her things about being a woman. She doesn't agree with all of them, and sometimes she thinks it's too much, but she does appreciate the person that took time to do things. And so I think the difference of this from Jane Eyre in terms of Jane leaving the home or leaving her location and leaving the Ed situation or the Edward situation is very key, because I feel like in Jane Eyre leaves because she feels like that's the right thing to do, and in this, Jane leaves to escape a feeling of guilt, which I do like the difference. Some people might see that like that's this author maybe missing the point of Jane Eyre, but I think it's important in this book that Jane be her own person and not have to be exactly like Jane Eyre, because this is more about her kind of figuring out her own self, whereas I do feel like Jane Eyre's a little further in her development in terms of knowing who she is. So she is able to make a choice based on doing the right thing, but I don't think that the point of this character in Jane is that she has the tools to do that yet, and that's what we're trying to work on with this. And so I like the change. Part 2 is about Jane's life in Seoul, Korea. I really like this particular part because I just like learning about the location. That's the fun part of reading, is like getting to travel in your mind. This is another part where I want to start off with my favorite little Easter eggs. One of them is that I really like that all the melodramatic elements that maybe wouldn't work in a modern retelling of Jane Eyre are sort of expressed through the concept of this fictional K-drama called Don't Throw Me Away and Leave Me. I like this element just because you get to see some of those things, but also because it does factor into the story as a way for people to kind of work through their own decisions, and also for people to give Jane advice, like her Aunt Emo to give Jane advice. I think it really shows how different forms of media and taking those in and either seeing yourself or your story sort of reflected in those, or also seeing just problems be worked out in different ways through books and television and movies can really kind of help you figure things out in a fun way. I also like that when Jane starts learning things about her parents through this element of the story, that her father's name ends up being Currer Bell, which is the pseudonym that Charlotte Bronte used to publish all her books. So we see a little bit of this first element that I'm going to talk about in part 1, but it's really further explored in this. Now, all through the first part, Jane and her Uncle Sang have had a lot of moments where they're at odds and they disagree on how to handle situations, and he does offer a lot of the pressure that she feels. But she starts to see in this part 2 something that I really enjoy. She starts to see Sang more as a human being. All of us, when we start to become adults, there is a point where we start to see that the people that raised us are not perfect people, or are not like as together as you thought they were. And she starts to see that Sang has a lot of similar struggles and pressures that she has. She isn't quite to the point where she understands him, but I do think she does see a lot of his backstory, what's going on, a lot of like his behavior and the way he like deals with her is because he often has not felt like he was enough to his family, and he is coming from, you know, a war-torn experience, and, trying to like find his way through trauma of that level. Perhaps these are maybe the reasons why he doesn't express emotion as well as his other family members. And also that he like feels kind of similar things. Like he also, like a lot of his family, because he moved to America, think that he's not Korean enough. So she starts to sort of see these elements and almost get an inkling of empathy for like his experience and what's going on. This is a good step forward for them. In regards to other family elements, this is a lot about her connecting with family in a new way and connecting with her past that she didn't know about. Now, this is kind of a cool element to the story because I feel like this is something that you don't really get in Jane Eyre. There's no element in Jane Eyre where Jane learns more about her mother and father. But I guess you could say that there's an element of family discovery with the Rivers family and that they're her cousins, but there's not that same element of connecting to the parental figure in your life or people that could become parental figures. So one element that I think is really enjoyable is that Jane connects with her Aunt Emo, and her aunt becomes like this mother-like figure. And I really like that Emo is good at packaging her words in a positive way. So she's really good at mediating and giving advice in a way that Jane has not experienced before in the novel, and really saying things that Jane needs to hear, but doing it in a way that's more positive than, say, her Uncle Sang would. So I think that is a really cool element of her discovering like a second mother experience. But on top of that, she does actually learn about her birth, about her parents, about how her parents met. She has been told a very negative view of her parents, and she finds out that none of that was true, that her parents did genuinely really want her, and that, they just ended up having a situation where they died, but they did stay together. They had a really healthy experience. Part of why she maybe has some of these negative connotations about her own self are these things that she always felt like she couldn't control because they were parental things, and finding out that she was really wanted and that, even, there is love for her in her family, even the times when she doesn't perceive it, is world changing on her self-esteem. There's a really interesting element of the change within yourself, creating a new self, that you can leave your situation where nobody knows you and become someone new and different. There's also a discussion in both part 1 and 2 about why we dress. As women. Why do women dress the way we do? Do we dress to appease the male gaze? Do we dress to do the opposite of appeasing the male gaze? Do we dress for career and what we think is appropriate for the careers that we've chosen? These are things that really are brought forth. Like, for example, Jane in Flushing and Brooklyn always wore tennis shoes, wore comfortable clothing, never really wore makeup, whereas when she's trying to get a job in Korea, her Aunt Emo's like, you need all new fashionable clothes, you need to put on like 50 layers of makeup, you need to do these things. And so she takes on these new things and sort of a new persona through that experience. And, to a certain extent, she is dressing the way that she feels is appropriate. But, is that, should you just dress for you? What does that mean? It does really make you think about fashion and clothing and beauty standards. Trends and beauty standards are ever changing, and how what is kind of considered not so good looking one day can be something that really is looked up to another day. And just thoughts on that can be really fun to explore. And I like that this explores that. Let's talk about Jane's dating life. So in this book, the character that's supposed to be sort of the equivalent to Sinjin is Chang Hoon, and I like him a lot better than Sinjin. Just want to say that. He does have the qualities where he is correcting her to a certain extent on some things, but he is not nearly as annoyingly particular as Sinjin is. However, this character does inspire this discussion about dating people because you think you should date that type of person. Like, she chooses this person because she thinks on multiple levels that this is an age-appropriate person of similar backgrounds. This will make my coworkers and my family happy if I date this person because it seems like I'm supposed to be with this type of person. And that doesn't mean that you necessarily connect on all the levels that you need to connect on, right? Even though it seems nice on paper. Jane's friend Nina, who we'll talk a lot more about in part 3, because I think she's such a great character for this story and where this story is trying to go. But her friend Nina says, every time I see you with him, it's like you're on a job interview and you think you're gonna blow it. So it's a new kind of pressure. Last thing I have written down here is probably something that I should have started with because it's something that's actually starts off this part of the story, but it's the use of the 9/11 Twin Tower attacks in New York as a story element. I was wondering, because it is set in 2001, the first time I read this book, if this was going to be a major plot point. It kind of is a plot point, but I'm glad it's not one that directly affects the characters. I think it would have been sort of disrespectful if it had been a plot point where we use real people's trauma to sort of move the plots of the story along. And so I'm glad that Patricia Park did not go that direction. But I do think that it's used in this really quality way of being a metaphor for connecting cities, as this book does, to yourself, where you live, to change, and how city landscapes change either through slow sort of the needs of the people and industrialism and slow change in that way, or through extreme trauma where things are destroyed. Now, as the cityscape changes in this book, so do the characters, and you find that, you know, a character might change the way they dress or the way they wear their makeup or the things that are important to them through different experiences. And so I think the 9/11 element is included to show elements about the community and kind of precipitate change in like this far away sort of way, but also to show just a metaphor for change in general. And that is all I have for part 2. I love the final part because it's all about consolidating everything that Jane has learned and experienced and her finding a way to sort of meet everything in the middle, since she has been in an in-between in so many areas of her life throughout the whole entire book. And it is chef's kiss to me. Before though we jump into like the great family and friendship stuff that I love about part 3, we gotta talk about my negative feelings about Ed Farley. It is safe to say that the endearingly awkward, somewhat problematic love that I have for Edward Rochester did not carry over to Ed Farley, because unlike the situation of Mr. Rochester, in which he is extremely humble. I think that makes him a much better person by the end of Jane Eyre. I will say that Ed does not experience this, and this leads to a lot of my problems with this man. Yet again, we're coming back to some of this age gap romance discussion. Now, here's what I want to talk about that more than the power dynamic thing, because I think we already kind of covered that. But the other thing that is sort of explored in this section in terms of Jane's feelings is that she feels like she overly relies on his experience because he is older, and he really uses that in this way that I perceive as somewhat manipulative to get his way. He's like, well, I've been there and I know better, and trust me, I know. There's also this element where Ed starts to try to make Jane start arguments and kind of divide her from her family and friends. A lot of the initial sort of lead-ups to an abusive relationship are the fact that the person that's the abuser tries to separate the other person from their friends and family. This is what Ed is doing. While I wouldn't say that he's straight up being an abuser, that is a indicator that one could become so. He only wants Jane to need him. He's the only one that can have her attention. He's the only one that she can care about. This is like me post reading the book that I read in my last vlog, which was Till We Have Faces, but it's that selfish love that really does not look at the wants and needs of the other person involved. Maybe on my third point on this, I'm talking about something that I don't know about. I've never been in a long-term relationship, but it seems like in that situation, both parties should want to be involved in each other's community and family to a certain extent, unless there's like drama there or there's like an extenuating circumstance. And if you don't want to be involved, why are we doing this? Another element of this does make you think of why Jane is not ready to be with Mr. Rochester in the early part of their relationship, and why perhaps their relationship will work better at the end of the book. And this is because Jane, and to a certain extent, Mr. Rochester, do not have any friends outside of their relationship. Jane doesn't have anybody. And I don't think that's healthy. Now, by the end of the book, she has met the Rivers, and she does, have the two Rivers women to rely on. I never really thought about the fact that Jane literally had no one, and that perhaps that is one reason why it's better that they got together the way they did at the end of the book. And there's this element too about the Ed and Jane relationship where we discuss emotional maturity. Ed really does try to pull this, I'm the smartest and most experienced person in this room, and you and your friends, Jane, are all stupid kids, and kind of vibe, when he is actually the emotionally immature one. He doesn't want to work on anything hard. He won't even talk to his own daughter about things that he needs to discuss to sort of create reconciliation between his daughter and Jane, because there's obviously some contention there. That's hard, and he doesn't want to do it. But he wants to say that everybody else is immature and selfish. And I'm not having it, and neither was Jane. So peace, Ed Varley. Good luck with your emotionally immature life. I was like, you know what? Perhaps some of the reason why Beth was so condescending to you was because you're an immature idiot. There, I said it. Let's jump to the Beth and Devin and Jane and Nina sort of a femininity situation. So one thing that I really think is interesting is that Beth does sort of become this freer, sort of slightly more relaxed person after the divorce from Ed. I think she was just trying too hard. While she still is Beth, don't get me wrong, she does relax a little bit, and also does through all this learning, take more time to spend with her daughter. Although here's where she's clueless, and here's where Jane comes in, and what I kind of love about the Jane-Devon relationship in this is that obviously Devon does hold some anger and some resentment for Jane, but there is this point where Devon realizes, and Jane to a certain extent realizes, that Jane really does care about Devon and her wants and needs, and that Jane understands a lot of things about Devon's struggle to fit in and Devon's life that, you know, her mother or like nobody else in her life could understand. I do like that that is a really nice bridge between these two characters with their commonalities, and that they are all, Beth and Devon and Jane are all able to kind of come to a nice bridge once we got Ed Farley out of the picture. And I think there's a really nice general moment where women really start to support women. For example, Nina, who becomes Jane's best friend at this end. I really like that they really figure out their friendship as roommates and trying to figure out how it works. They just communicate and tell each other things honestly. Nina does this the whole book, and I really love that about her character. While she's not like a direct equivalent to the Helen character in Jane Eyre, I do think she serves the same purpose that Helen does, which is to show Jane that there are like different things that she can look at, give her a different viewpoint. And I like that they're both like really honest with each other, and that even though they're brutally honest sometimes, they don't ever hate each other. And I really like that in this, all the bridges between all the female characters, for the most part, even Jane's aunt to a certain extent and her female cousin, really come together in this nice, really healthy, positive way. Also, that Nina and Jane really discover a really quality self-independence and self-reliance. I like that they are geared towards all the things that they've learned about their likes and dislikes, and how they found like certain things that they're really good at, and then they based it on those things. I really love that Jane and Zane come to this really wonderful place with their uncle-niece relationship. Well, I would even say that Singh at one point would maybe not say it in these words, but he does consider her like a daughter, and she starts to realize that. But I like the most is that they both start to see each other's perspective, though it's through a little bit of arguing. But after that, also learn to appreciate each other for who each of them is. Jane starts to get that, you know, Singh's love language is discipline. I say this because it's not unlike Anne of Green Gables. I always say when I talk about Anne of Green Gables that Marilla's love language is discipline, and Singh is very similar in that way. So that his love language is perhaps discipline, and that Jane just needs to know that it's not like anything personal. That's just his love language. And that Singh needs to maybe see that he needs to acknowledge Jane's really wonderful qualities, her intelligence, the fact that she does take initiative when she needs to, and the fact that she does have what Emo would say for the most part, a good family education, and, you know, allow her to do, you know, her own thing, and that's okay. Big takeaways for my final thoughts on part 3. And I wrote down first that coming of age means love for yourself, all you've learned, your family, your community, the old ways, and your new experiences. The other thing, and I'm going to quote Pink, the music artist, Pink. She's been saying in a couple of interviews, I quote, that love means always coming back to the table. So always being willing and open to communicate and to find those ways that work. Now, a lot of people from the outside would not understand how Jane's, you know, familial relationship with Singh is like functions, or they might not understand how her friendship with Nina is and how they have to have compromise. Everybody's going to have things about other people that bother them or that they don't like. But if you always come back to the table, you can figure out how it works for each individual relationship that you have. And this book really discusses that. And I also wrote down that you can cross divides when you allow people to just be. And I think that's a key message in this novel that's really enjoyable to consume. There's also this kind of interesting thought that I guess kind of ties to the servitude concept of Jane Eyre, which is that serving is actually a good thing. Serving your family and community is a good thing if you're all willing to do the work. I also love that this book in the epilogue ends with the concept of the word jung. Am I saying it right? Who knows? Loosely translated into English as love, affection, sympathy, or attachment, but there's no real direct translation. Part of it is longing for something that is lost or gone. It does give the book this nice sort of feeling where it's like a bittersweet feeling, shall we say, where you can still learn new things, still grow, still change. And it's okay to hold on or feel a nice sense of nostalgia for some of the old things. They taught you lessons, right? But you do have to sort of move on from them to grow. And some elements of those situations you'll miss. And some elements you're glad are gone. But there's like growth in sort of the kind of love that allows you to change. And I think that's a nice thought. If you're still around after this very, very long discussion, thanks for hanging out with me. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts on Jane were. If you liked it, if you disliked it, if you thought the concepts in this are cool, what concepts you thought were cool, if they were different from mine, all that fun stuff. I will see you in a little bit with a tag video, I think is what's coming up next. So I'll see you with something like that. And that's all I have for y'all.